This time on Engine Masters, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the dyno room. This time on Engine Masters, presented by AMSOIL, we are going full Bill Nye Science Guy. You see, here's what we've noticed in all our dyno testing. When you raise an engine's coolant temperature, it kills horsepower. And you may wonder why. We certainly did, and we think it's not the reason that you probably suspect, and that's what we're gonna find out here. So that'll be test one. Now, the other two things that we're gonna do is attempt heating up this intake manifold like crazy, see what that does as far as the temperature of the airflow, and lastly, we're gonna try and blast some heat directly down the carburetor and see what that does so that you can really judge, does a cooling system make horsepower? Does a cold air intake system make horsepower? We'll find out. And our victim is 598 cubic inches of whopping big block Chevrolet. You saw this in a prior episode called 598 cubic inches of horsepower versus torque. Well, this is the horsepower configuration. The bottom end is a Blueprint Engines crate motor, just a short block at 598 cubic inches. The top end is Brodix 365 oval ports that are all CNC'd. This is killer. It's got a big Hankin port-matched Brodix intake manifold and 1250 CFM of Holley Dominator. It's also got a pretty big solid roller camshaft. This thing is stout. The reason we chose such a big engine is that we think we're gonna see some really big changes because of the combustion chamber volume. But you never know until you find out, and the way we find out is by rolling this thing on the dyno. We're gonna fire it up and start making power before we start killing power.
So what we've added sensor-wise in addition to our normal stuff for this test was an air hat which will measure CFM. We have an air temperature sensor right under the base of the carburetor. We have another air temperature sensor only about 6 inches away so we can see if there's a temperature change from the base of the carburetor to the inlet port. We also added an EGT, exhaust gas temperature sensor, so we can see if the exhaust gas temperatures change between running it hot and cold. Like the old saying goes, you can't have too much data, but the important thing is to have the right data that you need.
This is kind of a weird test, dudes.
What do you mean?
Well, I'm trying to answer a question that nobody has really asked. How does temperature in the coolant and the intake manifold affect performance, and what can you do about it?
And we all know that's the way to cheat on the dyno.
Not cheating, it's optimizing.
Optimizing?
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, Steve. I didn't mean to offend you there.
That's right.
So I think the first test we're gonna do is run the thing cold coolant temperature and then run it hot coolant temperature and then look at data. We know it's gonna lose power, but I wanna find out why.
Well, first of all, it's carbureted. So we're going to see some latent vaporization and temperature drop in the intake manifold, unlike fuel injection where you're seeing kind of this constant air temp throughout the whole intake manifold.
So you and I have bench raced this a lot, so I have to ask Dulcich, why do you think an engine makes less power at heat?
Air density
Where?
on the induction side of the intake valve.
So you think at 190 degrees, the air in the intake manifold is going to be hotter than it would be if the coolant temperature was 125 degrees?
I think so.
Okay.
What do you think?
So Holdner first said it, and then you backed it up, that the air temperature in the intake manifold is not going to change with coolant temperature. And I've thought about that and thought about that and thought about that and didn't believe it, but I'm sort of coming around to it. But this is the test that's actually, I think, going to prove it. And he's done it before. So I say we just run it. And
Yeah, it's going to be some pretty interesting stuff, I think.
yeah. Okay, so our first run here is going to be with our 598 at a cold coolant temperature, and we haven't altered the temperature of the room or the intake manifold at all. Okay, let's have a look at our power peaks and then dive into some of the temperature numbers. Wow, we just made 790 pound-feet of torque, and it made 854.8 horsepower. And look at this thing, it's 700 pound-feet from the hit. Okay, so that's our baseline power number, but let's have a look at what the temperatures are telling us. The air in the intake runner started at 76, which is really close to room temperature, a little bit less, and then got cooler and cooler and cooler as we went. And it's not affected by wind chill factor. It's reading actual just temperature.
Well, there's more fuel with more air there because at idle, there's still a lot of air movement and banging around with the air, which causes some heat.
And we have to give Troy credit. It's overlap.
We're sitting here and Troy goes,
Yeah.
what about the overlap at idle?
Yeah.
Because there's all this,
Yeah.
and we both looked at Troy and went, wow.
Pork chop for the win.
So the air during the overlap cycle is coming back up and hitting this sensor. As the engine speed increases, there's less reversion and still the vaporization and cooling. There's still a difference there, and the air does heat up.
So let me summarize. We're looking at the temperatures in the room, under the carburetor, and in the intake runner. In the room, we were looking at 79 degrees. Under the carburetor, while the thing was running wide open at peak horsepower, it was 43 to 44 degrees. And in the runner, we saw 68 degrees. And so it got hotter from underneath the carburetor than it did in the runner. And our belief in that is because the airspeed is the molecules rubbing into each other and actually causing heat because of friction.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the nutshell of what we just decided, right?
I'm with you.
I agree.
And so once again, this is wide open throttle testing. Things would be different at part throttle cruising around. So the next thing to do is to heat this thing up to 200 degrees of coolant temp and see if it gets worse. Okay, we just spent a bunch of time heating this thing up. We've got it at 207 degrees right now. When we fire it, it'll probably go to 200. Let's see what happens. Moving fast before it cools off. Let's start with power numbers.
Or lack of.
Or lack of.
Wow.
Wow, so it dropped significant power. It went from 790 pound-feet to 774, and we went from 854 horsepower to 836. So let's see what happened with the temperatures though, because now our job is to find out why it loses power. 78 room temperature, the plenum, 42, so that didn't change. And the runner, 71, so that's up 3 degrees for a 70-degree swing. So I think we can now conclusively say, on an intake manifold like this with no heat crossover, etc., the temperature of the air in the intake manifold really didn't change with the coolant temperature.
Vapor lock doesn't happen at wide open throttle.
Right. So the next question is, why does it lose 15 plus?
When the combustion chamber temperature goes up, it becomes a higher pressure area. So it can't let as much air in. When the combustion chamber temperature is lower, when the intake valve opens and it's cooler in the combustion chamber, it's now a lower pressure area and will allow more air in.
Let's have a look at the CFM to see if that theory holds weight.
Ooh, 1125 CFM.
So this is CFM of airflow through the carburetor hat, and so when the engine is cold, it flows more air. Now we're just gonna straight look at the horsepower, and boom, it used the same amount of fuel.
Right.
Even though it used more air,
Well,
right?
Again, this kind of mimics the airflow.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, the higher engine coolant temperature indirectly kind of impedes airflow because it raises combustion chamber temperature and static pressure in the chamber, which is going to form a restriction to the airflow.
That is our belief at this point with this test.
Yeah.
What I'm absolutely sure of is I want hot oil and cold water.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Run a cold coolant temperature, hot oil temperature, and now let's move on to some stuff that probably applies to your life a whole lot more. I want to go heat up the intake manifold with some heat guns and find out what happens when you
I'm
do
gonna
that.
take one home to my wife for a hairdryer.
She will have no hair left. She will look like you.
Oh, that's frightening.
In our last test, we found out that the engine coolant temperature didn't have much effect on the air temperature going through the manifold. But what about the manifold itself? We see race guys go through a lot of trouble to keep the intake manifold cool in between rounds, and even the manufacturers They design manifolds with divorced runners and heat shields and even special gaskets, all in the name of keeping the manifold cool. Does it really make a difference? We'll find out.
These are our temperature sensors. So this is just reading air in the manifold right now. 136 in plenum, 179 in the runner. But let's go look at surface temperatures on that intake. Out here on these surfaces, it's only at about 136. But if you go down under here where the heat guns are all focused, look at that. I've got 268 to 70 degrees. We're gonna find out if that affects performance or not, and if it affects the temperature of the air inside the manifold as it's running or not. So now we've isolated it down to nothing but a hot metal surface of the intake manifold. And when it was just parked there, it affected the air inside the manifold. But we're gonna find out what happens when we run it. Doesn't care, not even a little bit. We got spots on that intake manifold that I measured at 260 degrees plus.
Measure it now real quick.
Yeah, let me go out there and measure it again and see what we got.
All right, Steve, what does it look like we've got?
We're within 1 horsepower of our best run.
Oh, really? That is incredible. I don't think you'd see that on the drag strip, would you?
No.
Okay, I went and measured right after the pull. The part of the valley pan that was 260 plus is now 224.
Okay.
And the part of the runner that was at 230 plus is now 204. So still huge temperature in the metal itself, but it didn't translate into the air at all. You saw the air temperature was just consistently plummeting as we were running the thing, because pretty much as soon as you started the thing rolling, it evacuated the hot air that had heat soaked in there, and it was pulling in the ambient, cooling it through the carburetor, and making just as much power as it did before.
And the air is moving too fast to absorb heat from the hot manifold. Because
Right.
the manifold remain hot, but the air is more a function of what your ambient is, because it goes zooming through that manifold so fast.
Yep. You know what we have to do next?
Go upset every super stock and stock eliminator racer in the nation.
Pretty
Chill
much
it.
every bracket racer everywhere.
Yes.
We're gonna go throw ice on it now and see if that even matters. Next, we just tried heating up the manifold, and now we're gonna do the thing that so many drag racers do between rounds, ice the intake manifold.
Can I just ramrod ice cubes right into there?
Don't be mad at you getting water all over the floor.
You think I could just ramrod ice cubes right into the valley pan?
You can pour a few, but it's gonna leave water everywhere.
See?
It'll just look cooler, and it'll cool better.
They don't let you do that drag racing.
What?
That.
They don't do this, but I still want to get the manifold as cold as we can. We're already pouring water all over the ground.
Are we?
Yes.
No way.
Yes.
That's impossible. Yeah, you're right. That was a bad idea. It seems to me as though the ice melted really quickly. I really wanted to stick ice cubes right inside the manifold, but it's making a mess of the dyno floor. So we're gonna abandon that approach and stick with the plastic bags. Hopefully Relay doesn't kick me out.
Okay, so we'll be packing this thing with ice, letting it sit, get it as cold as we possibly can, measure it, and fire it up again, find out if it makes a difference. It doesn't make a difference.
I've kind of created a little bit of a lake in there with my uncontrolled ice.
We've had this intake packed in ice for about 45 minutes. That's as cold as it is gonna get. Over here we got 34 degrees. That's cold. Let's go find out if it makes any difference at all. Okay, this is gonna be good. There's nobody at any drag strip anywhere who's gonna get a manifold any colder than that unless it's the dead of winter in New York.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We
Or
got it
maybe a
cold.
nitrous bottle. Nitrous bottle right up against it might do it. Ice, ice, baby!
I didn't see what the power did, but the air temperature looked a lot colder
It
to
was
me.
a lot colder. It was 40 degrees colder. We just made 805.9 pound-feet of torque and 861 horsepower and more power at every point in the curve. That's crazy.
I apologize to all the stock and super stock racers I've offended.
Right. That is absolutely the correct thing to do. That's amazing. Once again, look how the gap narrows as it gets up here. How is it that the manifold imparts cooling to the air in the manifold, but not heat to the air in the manifold?
You know what? Move more CFM too.
Let's look at the air temp. Before we were looking at 78 or 88 degrees in the intake manifold. And here we're looking at 44 degrees right under the carburetor and 44 in the runner. It killed 40 degrees out of the manifold air temperature in the runner.
I have no idea. It made more power.
It made more power. How do you explain that when the cold manifold works but the hot manifold doesn't?
It's perplexing.
Is it because the gasoline's colder?
Well, the air temperature in the plenum was 40 degrees colder.
Not in the plenum, in the runner.
The runner was colder and the plenum was colder too. We'll have to look at these temperatures. We have to do some number crunching here.
Yeah. Here's what's blowing our minds right now. When we heated up the intake manifold, it didn't seem to make a difference in power, even though the heat came up inside the manifold just a little bit on the air temp. When we chilled the manifold, it made tons of power, and it did chill the air inside the manifold. So we couldn't get our minds around why the air was not sucking heat out of the manifold, but the manifold was sucking heat out of the air when it was cold. It just doesn't make sense. So we called our physicist buddy, Billy Godbold at Comp Cams, and I'm actually kind of proud that I think I kind of stumbled into it. I just pat myself on the back there. It happens to be because of the temperature of the fuel, or at least that's our working theory right now. When the manifold was hot, the fuel was hot. When the manifold was cold, the fuel was cold, and a colder droplet takes longer to vaporize, and so it'll pull more heat out of the air because it has more time to do so. And so our next step is a chilled manifold and hot fuel to find out what that does. And once we run that, we're probably gonna be completely confused all over again. That'd be my guess. Ready? Here we go.
Way to think it through, Freiberger.
Genius. Not me. The test is like just the greatest. Wow. So it is not the air that matters, it's the fuel.
Well, the transfer is not from the manifold wall to the airstream.
Right.
The difference in temperature is because of the starting point of fuel temperature.
Which we now know is a result of manifold temperature as it moves its way up into the carburetor. We've made that manifold scorching hot. What did we just learn here?
Well, compared to the test this morning, unchilled manifold,
It's the same.
basically within a couple horsepower repeatability.
So the carburetor temperature is the operative factor here, and
Exactly.
the
Pretty
temperature of the manifold is not as significant.
What I also wonder is if the colder manifold keeps the fuel cooler longer as it enters the intake, even if it's more ambient.
Right.
The manifold itself is keeping the fuel cool, not so much taking heat out of the air.
Right.
Basically, heating the carburetor took all the advantage out of cooling the intake manifold.
So the carburetor was more important than the intake to be cold.
Yeah, and all those guys that used to run the old Moroso
Cool
cool
cans?
cans, I scoffed at that.
I did too. I
thought-
figured it was good to prevent vapor lock.
Yeah, me too. I thought, how's that gonna add power? But those guys would have done it for a reason, and it makes sense now.
Old is new again.
Yeah.
Yeah. We probably just discovered something that people have known for
man.
40 years.
We can make a fortune with a fuel cooler. Oh no, they've had that already.
Wow. What an education.
It's been a
it
roller
has
coaster
been.
today.
It really
was
has.
really cool.
We've made some misstatements along the way, but the physics of it all added up. Every time we got our head around it, you start looking at all the data and you're like, of course, it adds up.
You know the bump in the road? We do all this testing again on a fuel injected manifold.
It's totally different.
Completely different
because there's
results.
no fuel in the air.
Yep.
Yep. Yeah. Well, but I think we can derive nothing. I know nothing.
Because at this point, yeah, I'm not going to assume or pretend to know anything. This was a fun day.
Okay, Dulcich, it's on us to go out there and try and take all of this and explain it in 30 seconds to make some sense so that we can apply it to our lives.
Oh, no problem, man. I've got it all up here.
Man, that was an awesome day on the dyno.
Oh man, class was in session because I learned all kinds of stuff that I thought I knew, but I was dead wrong.
Well, or at least we didn't know what we didn't know. So the first test that we did was, why does an engine lose power when it runs hot? And you think it's because the intake gets hot and the intake charge gets hot and it's less dense and you lose power. But I think what we proved is that was not it.
No, because we measured the air temperature and it hardly changed at all.
So here's our theory about why a hot engine doesn't make as much power. We believe that power is reduced through a hot engine because the hot combustion chamber is a higher pressure area that does not allow airflow to go through the engine as expediently as it does with a colder chamber. We're in agreement on that, right?
I'll buy it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then the other one was all about expansion ratio, which is when you have compression and then the combustion process, you get more power out of a greater expansion ratio, which is a difference between the beginning temperature and the end temperature.
Not only that, but the beginning parts where you have the most cylinder pressure buildup,
Right.
the greater change in volume because the piston's way up top.
Right.
Towards the end.
And so when you start with a hotter beginning temperature, there is not as big a delta across your expansion ratio, and so basically it's not making enough power. So those are the two reasons I think that we learned why a hot engine makes less power. But that moves on to the next tests that we did. And we couldn't understand how it was that when the manifold is hot, it doesn't impart heat to the air, but when the manifold's cold, it pulls heat out of the air. Mind blown. So we did a lot of research. We talked to Billy Godbold and ultimately came to the conclusion of running the cold manifold with a hot carburetor, which answered virtually everything, which is this: cold fuel is more important than a cold intake manifold. It is the fuel that has a greater percentage of heat draw out of the intake charge than the air itself, or the ability of the manifold to pull temperature out of the air. So icing the manifold isn't the key, icing the carburetor is the key.
Yeah, and that's what happened when we were testing. We were blowing super hot air at the manifold. We weren't blowing anything at the carburetor, but all of that heat was just
Radiated
right up here.
Yep.
So
it's amazing. Cold fuel makes power, hot fuel, not so much. But on EFI, it could be a completely different story because there's no fuel in the manifold on those deals. Maybe we need to test that next time.
I don't know.
Where?
Right here on a future episode of Engine Masters.
Neighborhood of 850. It's based on a blueprint. This is the horsepower, ending hotter. So you're